open up in your Chumashim to the opening verse of Parshat Va'Era, page 351, that Barry read just a few minutes ago. This is very obvious to say, but sometimes it bears repeating. Since we divide the books of the Torah into parashiot, and we divide them into aliyot, we sometimes manufacture distances between narrative sections that are not intended by the full text, right? So when you finish a parsha, even if you start thinking about it for the next week, you tell yourself there's a break there, and by the time you get to the next verse, it's as if something long has transpired, right? But in the sweep of the Torah, the second verse of the 6th chapter of Shemot is just the next verse after the first verse of the 6th chapter of Shemot, even though we wait a week to read it. And the reason why I mentioned that is because, at least through the commentaries that we're going to look at, it's much more interesting to understand what's going on in the opening lines of Parshat Va'Era if you don't read it as the beginning of something, but as a continuation of the narrative, okay? So let's see what order I want to do this. Let's read the verse, because the verse on its own does not stand out as so challenging, but commentators are very playful with it. Okay. Vaydaber Elohim el Moshe. Elohim, one of the names of God that we have, spoke to Moses, Vayomer Elav, and said to him, Ani Adonai, I am Yud-Heh Vav-Heh, I am God. In general, but it's not 100% the case, the word Vaydaber means speak, and Vayomer means say. The difference being Vayomer more often is followed by quotation marks, like he said ... Whereas you can say in English the word he spoke, and you don't need anything followed it, but you can't say he said without it following what he actually said. Okay, most of the time that's true in Hebrew. And what's coming after this is another one of God's speeches to Moshe about how Moshe is going to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. If we read a little bit more, the first word of the next verse, which is the word from which the parsha gets its name, Va'era, I appeared. That's from the root ro'et, to see, but it's in the nifal, it's in the passive. I appeared El Avraham, El Yitzchak. I appeared to Abraham and to Isaac, El Yaakov, Be'el Shaddai. I appeared in the form of my divinity, that is El Shaddai, the God who is Almighty. Ushmi Adonai, but my more intimate name, I'm doing a little bit of translation, a little bit of commentary at the same time. My more intimate name, Adonai, Lo Nodati Lehem, I never made known to them, meaning I held back some of my godness from those generations, but I'm not going to hold back now. V'gam hakimoti et briti itam. And now I want to remind you, Moses, that I made a covenant with them, a brit, lat lehem and Eretz Canaan, to give them the land of Canaan. And I don't know if you've noticed, Moshe, but you guys are far from Canaan, which means that my promise has not yet been fulfilled. At Eretz Mugurehem, the land where they sojourned, Asher Garuva, that they lived there. And then we're not going to read it word for word, but it goes on to say that I've heard their crying and I'm in charge, I'm going to take care of it. Okay, that's how Va'era begins, and it's within Va'era, of course, that we get to the beginning of the 10 plagues, because Moses goes back to Pharaoh. If you're reading this, trusting the fact that we're beginning a parsha means we're starting something. What we're starting is really the real Exodus story, right? The real moment where Moses gets sent back to Egypt to free them. But commentators look really closely at the first verse, and they wonder something. Can anyone guess whether you remember this from Rashi class when we were on this verse, Alan? Probably 3 years ago?
Not quite that.
I don't know. We're almost at the end of Parshat Bo, usually about 18 months of Parsha, maybe not quite that long, okay? Anyone guess or remember if you're a rabbinic commentator on the Torah and you're forcing yourself to have a question about the opening line of this Parsha, whose vocabulary is very simple, right? Vaydaber, speak, Elohim, God, El Moshe, to Moses, Vayomer, said, Elav, to him, Ani Adonai. There are no rare words here. What question could you ask on that?
What was God doing just before?
what was God doing just before? Okay, so we might want to remind ourselves what the previous context was. We'll get back to that in a second. What else might you ask from within the language of the verse? In talking about verse 2, right? The second verse of the Parsha, third verse of the chapter. We might ask, what made God pull back the intimacy to not show Adonai to the ancestors? What else specifically on the first verse, Edward?
Why did he say any Adonai?
Good. So Edward's saying, what's the significance of God saying at the end of the verse, Ani Adonai? Is it to disabuse Moses of a notion that God is not God? Is it to distinguish Adonai from El Shaddai or Elohim, right? If you've done a little bit of playful work with the way the rabbis understand how God speaks to the Jewish people in the Torah, there is some kind of a distinction between Elohim and Adonai in general. The distinction as Elohim being the God of judgment, of law, of boundaries, and Adonai, Yud He Vav He, being the God of mercy, intimacy, and kindness. So we might say, why do both names appear in this verse? And if Elohim is speaking, is Elohim having a schizophrenic moment? Elohim says, I'm not Elohim. Elohim says, I am Adonai. What's going on there? Last week in Kol Tfilah, Rabbi David Ingber had a beautiful, only David Ingber could come up with this notion, that he thinks that the best way of rendering Adonai Eloheinu is not as a redundancy, Adonai is our God, but Adonai represents the softest, most merciful aspect of our tradition. That is our God. That is our might. You want to know what the God of what the godlike quality of the Jewish people is? It's Adonai, right? So Eloheinu is a more generic term for divinity. What's the Jewish divinity? Adonai is our divinity. What's the Jewish connection with the heavens? The most merciful. That's a lovely read, but it's not necessarily pshat. Yes, Alan.
Going back to Adonai, it says, that it's not known to them as Adonai, and yet in the text there are all sorts of references.
Correct.
That says that Adonai spoke to.
Correct.
Isaac and Jacob.
Correct. As Alan said, I'm going to repeat because not everyone hears on Zoom that even the testimony that God is giving in verse 3 seems to be belied by many, many verses in the book of Genesis where Yud He Vav He does appear. Okay. Without cheating, does anyone remember the immediate antecedent to this verse? What's the first verse of chapter 6 or the end of chapter 5? Anyone know? What just happened? So God tells Moses he's going to take them out b'yad chazakah. What other narrative happened recently?
Didn't say that, tell Moses that Pharaoh was going to not let them out, and then God will take care of them?
Several times there's an interaction between God and Moses where God says, by the way, Moses, Pharaoh's going to harden his heart and I'm going to take them out. But there's a very particular thing that happens that's important to understand some of the comments we're about to read. Go back to the end of Parshat Shmot. A little bit early, yeah, that's a little bit earlier on. It's not the, you're right that the fleeing and the midnight circumcision and the fever dream, that's a little bit earlier on, but exactly immediate. Look back to page 340. There's an important narrative here. 340.
So Moses was asking, why did you come to me? Everything that I've said has made everything worse.
Right. At the end of the Parshat Shmot, well before things get better because of God's influence in the story, things get worse. If you look at verse 15, Vayavo shotrei bnei Israel, the foremen of the slaves, right, the kapos, as it were, right, the Jews who were put in charge of forcing the labor out of their own people, Vayitzaku el Paro, they yelled at Pharaoh lemor, they said, Lama tasu kol lavadecha, why are you dealing this way? You're making our jobs building your buildings harder. Tevin einitan lavadecha. There's no straw. And why is there no straw? Because Pharaoh's first response to the request, lighten our load, is make it harder. Okay? Avadecha mukim, your servants are like shmatas, v'chatat amecha, but it's your fault, Pharaoh. Verse 17, Vayomer nirpim atem nirpim, you're just slackers, Pharaoh says. Al ken atem omrim, that's why you're saying, Nelchav v'nizbachad l'Elohein l'Adonai, that's why you keep saying you don't want to work anymore, you want to go and slaughter to your God in the desert. V'ata lechu v'ivdu, go back to work. V'teven lo yinaten lachem, there's going to be no straw given to you, you're going to have to make it. V'tochen levenim titenu, you still have to make as much as you were making before. Verse 19, Vayerusho treven Israel otam berale more. So the foremen of the Israelites, they were in trouble. They said, Lo tigru melivnechem devar yom yomo. They said, we went to Pharaoh, we tried to lighten the situation. Sorry, you still have to make the same quota. Vayivku'u et Moshe v'et Aaron. They attacked. They were wroth with Moses and Aaron. Nitzavim likratam, who came to meet them. B'tzeitam me'et Paro, as they left Pharaoh. Vayomru lehem, they said to them, Yerei Adonai lechem v'yishpot. God, may God punish you for what you've done. Asher hivashtem et rechenu, you've made us smelly in the eyes of Pharaoh. You've made things worse. Uvenei avadav. Ateitchera bi'adam lahargenu, you've basically given them a sword by which to kill us. We thought that by involving you in this, our situation would be ameliorated. You're making it worse. And what happens next? Vayashov Moshe el Adonai. Moses basically says, you know what? They're right. God originally sent me in. God promised me that by my being sent in, I would be able to eventually lead the Israelites out of Egypt and reduce their horror. I've made it worse. I've become an instrument of further misery. And so he goes back to God, Vayomar, and he says, Adonai, my God, this is pronounced Adonai, but it's not Yud He Vav He. Lama harayot la'am hazeh. Why are you dealing so miserably with this people? Lama zeh shlachtani. Why have you sent me? Ume'az bati el Paro, from the moment that I came to Pharaoh because you told me to, l'daber bishmecha, to speak in your vaunted name, hera la'am hazeh. It's been awful. V'hatzel lo hitzalta et amecha. You have not done anything to save your people. Who likes to be yelled at? Raise your hand if you like being castigated by a subordinate. Parshat Shmot ends not, like, we're very far from the burning bush. We're very far from Moses being convinced by God, even though I don't want to do this job, I'm going to do it because I feel like your strength's behind me. We have the servant that God sends to Pharaoh to make the situation better for the Israelites, angry that because of him it's gotten worse, and he yells at God. Now, later on, particularly in the Hasidic tradition, it's okay to geshrai at God. If you want to yell at God in your prayers, go ahead, our tradition can handle it. But it's interesting that in the text for Moses to point the finger back at God, because if we try to believe the internal logic of the story, Moses doesn't yet know how this is going to turn out. We know, we want to whisper to Moses, just be patient, be patient. Moses doesn't know. He says, you're making things worse. Alan and then Diego.
You say it doesn't work out, but okay. You said that Moses doesn't know what's going on, but yet if you look at chapter 4, 21 through 23, you see exactly what's going on, even with God telling Moses, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart and I'm going to kill his firstborn.
Yes, but Moses hasn't lived the story yet. So Moses doesn't know that God's prediction is going to come true. We know, but Moses doesn't know that. So Moses has more of a right to be angry in the scene because he is living through it and has not experienced the end. He's been prophesied, but hasn't experienced it.
Yeah, but if he's getting a prophecy from God, he's going to say this isn't going to happen?
Well, that's what makes the effrontery here so interesting, and that's going to be the engine for the commentary we're going to look at. This seems like effrontery. Have you no faith? Diego?
So
Rebecca, can you close the door, Rebecca?
in my past life as a consultant, sometimes it's been expedient for to be castigated by the client when there is a need for a continued presence of the consultant, meaning sometimes at the end of a phase one, the best way to end it is with we did an intervention and there's more work that needs to be done. And so when I see God speak of a greater might, sometimes it could be that Hashem is intervening only to say, do not worry, to the greater effect of what's coming to follow.
It's a wonderful association. The first chapter of verse 6, which Chazal, our sages, just chose to be the end of the Parsha, seems to have God not being angry in response to Moses's pushing, but basically saying, don't worry, I've got your back, it's all going to work out. But once we get to our verse and Va'era begins, the commentaries almost glide, or some of the commentaries almost glide over the last verse of the previous Parsha. So look at the sheet. Yeah. Yeah.
So is that why so at the end, it starts with Vayomer Adonai el Moshe.
Right, Yud Hey Vav Hey, yeah.
And now we're going to Vaydaber Elohim, but reminding Moses that remember that Adonai that I told you about.
Good. Remember that when we get to the third source on the sheet, Kathy. Good. Okay, look at the first source. The first source is really as almost like a straw man that we're going to knock down, at least for the reading I want to give. Not that I want to knock down Sforno. I'm not a Sforno knocker downer. Rabbi Ovadia Sforno, 15th, 16th century Italy. On the phrase Ani Adonai, according to Sforno, this is why God, speaking as Elohim, reintroduces himself to Moses as Adonai. And I'll just lead you a little bit. He's not going to say that the significance of Yud Hey Vav Hey here is compassion, soft, loving kindness, but a different understanding of God's godness. This is deep, chunky philosophy in just a few lines. Ani Adonai Mekayem HaMitziut. I'm the one who maintains existence, reality. Mitziut from the root matzah, which means to find. Not matzah with a hey, that's bread. Matzah with an aleph means to find, meaning mitziut is all things that are found. Lo mamtzio bilvad. It's not just that I called reality into existence. Aval gam mekaymo. It only continues because of me. She'ein lenimtsaot shum yeshut v'kiyum zulati. That nimtsaot, things, it's translating here as existence, but literally anything that is found in the world has no yeshut. You may never ever heard the word yeshut, but it's spelled from the word yesh. Yesh means there is. It's very hard to translate yeshut into Hebrew, like there isness, right? Like the entity, right? The character of existence, or kiyum, or perpetuation, zulati, without me, nothing can exist. Ma sha'ani mashpia alehem, except for that which I influence upon them. Mashpia from the root shefa, which means to glow or to bestow. Umizeh yitchayev, she'ein l'shum nimtza kiyum mitziut bilti ratzoni. And therefore, it's obligatory to understand that there's nothing that exists in reality without my will. Aside from it being a nice little philosophical treatise, how is Sforno explaining the significance of what God is saying to Moses with the words Ani Adonai? How does this resolve the problem, Rebecca?
Well, I think rather than saying Adonai, he's saying the Yud Hey Vav Hey, which I guess is based on the Shorish Yihiyeh, or being, and Vayihior. And so I am using that term is basically saying I am the creator of everything.
Correct. And therefore, what's the message back to Moshe, according to Sforno?
Everything's okay.
God,
I'm taking care of it all. Without me, none of this is happening anyway.
Very good. So Sforno is reading Ani Adonai as God flexing God's muscles. You've attacked me, Moses. Remember all the way the previous verse, right? At the end of last week's Parsha, where you suggested to have it all under control. Nothing exists without me, right? That's my Adonai-ness. My Adonai Havaya, that is the essence of who I am. You don't have to be concerned. And this is God allaying Moshe's fears, legitimate fears, but allaying and saying, Pharaoh, if he has any power, he has power over people. I have power over reality. You're good. AJ? Someone sent me an email this week to remind the tech that we need 5 microphones on Shabbat afternoon, because I only remember on Shabbat when I can't remind myself.
So is Sforno actually in a very short statement talking about God allowing what we would call evil to exist? In other words, the whole thing we struggle with, hardening of Pharaoh's heart, where God allows Pharaoh, God creates Pharaoh. God creates all the bad guys as well as all the good guys. Yeah. And God allows the bad guys to do what they do.
I mean, I would say that Sforno isn't talking about that here per se, but yes, that's a logical extension that any evil that you experience in the world is also part of my plan, but it's going to work out okay. Yeah.
I give Sforno a lot of credit, so I think he is.
I want to read Rashi as a ramp up to the Mehashiloach, the Hasidic text number 3. Rashi reads this slightly more classically than Sforno does, with, as I said before, Elohim being the God of might, and Adonai Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh being the God of delight or intimacy. And what does Rashi say? Why is it Vayidaber Elohim, Elohim spoke, and said, Ani Adonai, Diber ito mishpat. God spoke to Moses, it's translated here, this is not my translation, censoriously. Took him to task, mishpat, like with judgment. Why? Al shehiksha ledaber, because Moses had the chutzpah to speak to God at the end of the previous parsha and say, Lama harayot la'am hazeh. So since you, Moses, wagged your finger at me, I'm going to bark back at you. And I'm going to bark because Vayedaber is the harsher form of speaking than Vayomer, and Elohim is the harsher form of God than Adonai. So Rashi says, Moses, this was coming to you. You don't yell at your supervisor without expecting to get pushback. And you don't yell at God without expecting a harsher version of God to come, which makes the Mei HaShiloach so much more beautiful. Before I teach the Mei HaShiloach, who in the room has a dog? What does a dog do when you accidentally hurt it? Like you pull its tail by accident, or you bump into it. It usually does 2 things right in a row. What does it do?
Yelp and run away.
Yelp and whimper, right? It barks and then apologizes, right? My dog did this. We took him out of the house for a walk, and because he doesn't walk well because he's slightly disabled, he's always underfoot. He like, you can never like anticipate where he's going to be, and so sometimes by accident we like step over him, and every time we do that, like he barks at us saying, "Don't do that to me," and then goes, and it comes back, and he's my interpretation. I don't care if I'm wrong. My interpretation is I apologize that I barked. I barked on instinct. That's not how I feel about you. I think the Ishbitzer Rebbe, the Mei HaShiloach, had a dog, okay? Vayidaber Elohim el Moshe vayomer elav ani Adonai.
Sociologically, virtually impossible.
That he had a dog, yeah. I know.
The allergy of Eastern European Jews to dog was absolutely intense.
For those of you on the Zoom, somebody who knows a little bit about this, Dr. Michael Berman said there's no way that the Ishbitzer Rebbe in Poland had a dog, but somewhere in his former life, I think he did. Okay, so look what he says. So the Ishbitzer Rebbe, he wrote a book called the Mei HaShiloach, the Waters of Silwan, if you've ever been to Ir David down outside the walls of the old city. And this is his commentary on the verse. Achar shediber, anyone know what that acronym is? Mem Resh Ayin Hey? Moshe Rabbeinu Alav HaShalom. Moses, our teacher, may peace be upon him. After Moses spoke Dvarav Neged Hashem Yitbarach, after he critiqued the Holy One, may his name be blessed, Al Kain, because of that, Natan Hashem Yitbarach, the Holy Blessed One, gave Moses Ga'ara, a beating, a beatdown, a rebuke. He put a rebuke on him. Zeh lashon v'yedaber. That's why this parsha begins v'yedaber. Shehu lashon kasher, as we discussed. The two ways of discussing speech in Hebrew, the rabbis imagine that the one that is daled bed reish daber is a harsher way of speaking. Gam Hashem Elohim moreh al zeh. And also the fact that the name of God in the first part of the sentence is Elohim also illuminates, moreh, teacher, about that. Ach techef, but right afterwards, like a dog, right afterwards we get Vayomer Elav, the softer Vayomer and the softer God. And I love how he says it here. Zehu ka'adam, this is like a person or a dog. Sheko'es al chavero, who's angry at his fellow. V'ohavo, but he really loves him. You can change the genders here, right? A person who is angry at someone near them, but really they don't want to be angry, they want to love them. V'chasher ro'ehu omeid, when you see the person that you've yelled at standing there, mishtomem, quiet, umefached, and afraid. Like, you know that burst of endorphins you get when you finally yell the thing you've been wanting to yell, and it feels so good to get it out, and then you look on the face of the person upon whom you vomited, right? If you love the person, it's gonna have an impact on you. Az miramez lo, he hinted to Moses, ki kol ka'aso, all of his anger, eino rak lifnim. This is an interesting phrase. I'm not sure I'm translating it properly because Hasidic uses of Hebrew is different than standard. Lifnim usually means internal, but it doesn't really make sense here for him to say that God was saying to Moses that all of his anger was internal, because it actually had been externalized by him yelling at him. So I'm not sure exactly what the Mei Shiloach means by lifnim. One of the translations I found said was momentary. That's not what the word lifnim means, but we get the point that God yelled diber Elohim and then hinted to Moses, I wasn't really as mad as I came off. I apologize. V'chein hu inyan shel vayomer elav ani Adonai. That is indeed the meaning of that that he said with the root omer, which is the softer, ani Adonai, I am chesed, I am loving kindness, I am soft. Ki amira, because the way of speaking using the language amira, lashon raka, is the language of softness. Hainu shalachashlo, he whispered into Moshe's ear, she'eno bekas chas v'shalom. He's not really angry, God forbid. V'zeh inyan ani Adonai. This is the language of I am God. Kishem, here's back to you, Rebecca, Havaya, right? The name of God that has the notion of being in it, hu malei rachamim, is just overflowing with mercy. V'hag'ara shagarti bach, and that bark that I barked at you with, that anger, lo haya rak lifnim, same word again. It was only internal, it was only momentary. V'lo tevached, don't lo tevached klal, and don't be afraid. What I love about comparing the Mei Shiloach to the Sforno is that they're both using this language as a way of mollifying Moses, but with opposite ends of the divine characterological spectrum. Sforno says that God says back to Moses, don't you worry, I'm the most powerful thing in the planet, and no one can defeat me, and certainly not you, and your rebuke means nothing to me, so we're fine. And the Ishbitzer saying is, don't worry, Moses, I'm a softie, and all I want is for you to be okay, and all I want is for my people to be free, and I know things look bad right now, but come close to me and we'll work it out together. I learn an important piece of Torah, particularly from the Ishbitzer, because, you know, like every human being that's ever lived, it's sometimes hard to restrain impatience, anger, frustration, even and sometimes especially with the people we love the most, right? The people that we spend the most amount of time with and we have the most amount of expectations from are the ones who are going to frustrate us the most, right? And I love that the Mei Shiloach is basically giving us not the proactive suggestion that we get angry, but the permission, because sometimes we do. Sometimes we lose control. Sometimes we are at Vayedaber Elohim. We are responding to the poke. It is very hard not to be responding to the poke, like a dog. But also like God, we have an obligation as soon as we can afterwards to go the route of Vayomer Ani Adonai, and to say with the softest voice, when it comes down to it, I want our relationship to be one of kindness and softness and embrace, and I'm sorry. I was in a situation recently that I'll keep completely anonymous, where someone did something, I guess to me, that really, by all objective standards, shouldn't have done. It wasn't horrific. It wasn't terrible, but it hurt. And when I encountered this person and processed it with this person, the one thing I didn't get from the person was an unalloyed apology. Got a lot of defensiveness, a lot of buts, a lot of "be understand." And what I said to the person afterwards, it's amazing to think how much of an impact it would have had on me had the first thing out of your mouth been, "I'm really sorry." I'd been over it. I've been over it. If the first person in an encounter who can move to Ani Adonai, right? Not I am God, but I'm sorry, I'm repentant, melts an encounter and allows a relation to go forward. And it only happens 1,000 times a day. So God struggled with it, but found a way to come back. We struggle with it as well. And boy, Hasidic teachings on the interactions of human beings were exceedingly wise, pre-psychological, and give us a lot to think about in terms of how we control ourselves and find our way back into loving relationship. Last comment, Ed.
Is it better to be perceived cruel in order to be loving, rather than to perceive to be loving, rather than be cruel?
Is it better to be cruel
To be perceived cruel,
and be loving?
in order to be loving, then you perceive to be loving, but the reality, the intention to be cruel.
Yeah.
So which is?
I don't have an answer to that. I think it's probably not. I think one shouldn't create opportunities to be kind through one's meanness, right? That seems a little manipulative and Machiavellian, right? So I like to tighten the screw just so that when I release it, the person feels relief. I know that's not an exact answer to your question, but we do that also. Like we sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously make things worse so that when we make things better, like the interaction between the Israelites and Pharaoh, they'll feel a little bit of a relief. But this stuff is hard. It's hard not to bark. But we all have the God of Rachamim deep inside of us.